Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the session on my vision of Sri Lankan English writing as I see it, as I want it. So we are starting the panel today with three of our panelists, Ameena Hussein, Thakshala Tissera, and Mahesh Hapugoda. So I will start the session, first of all, by introducing our three panelists for the day. Starting off with Ameena Hussein. Ameena Hussein is the author of Chasing Telltales and Mystics, Ibn Battuta in Sri Lanka, which is also shortlisted for the Gratian Prize in 2020, Moon in the Water, and Zilich, and 15, a collection of short stories. She has been trained as a sociologist and is the co-founder of Perera-Hussein Publishers, a leading publishing house in Sri Lanka, reputed for cutting-edge and innovative publications. Ameena has also been shortlisted for the Gratian Prize in 1999 and has been in the long list of several international prizes. And then for our second panelist, Thakshala Tissera. Thakshala Tissera is a researcher with a focus on animal studies and environmental humanities through post-colonial frameworks. She has taught literature, composition, and English for specific purposes at the Universities of Colombo, California, and Massachusetts Amherst. Thakshala is currently a doctoral candidate at the Department of English, University of Massachusetts Amherst. Then to Mahesh Hapugoda. Mahesh Hapugoda is a lecturer in English at the Department of Languages, Sabaragamu University of Sri Lanka. With an experience of 20 years in the field of tertiary education, he has authored several books and has published extensively. His research interests include reading politics, philosophy, and literature, and writing reviews on contemporary issues and matters of political interest. Mahesh is also a critic of modern music and film. So first of all, I would like to invite the panelists to make an opening statement regarding the topic, my vision of Sri Lankan English writing as I see it, as I want it. Can I invite Ameena Hussein to make her opening statement?
Good morning, everybody. And thank you for inviting me to New Ink. I'm really happy to be here. And thank you all who have woken up fairly early on a Sunday morning to be with us. As you might gather from what I say, I speak with three hats, that of a writer, that of a reader, and that of a publisher. And from each of these perspectives, I have only one want, because the title is what I want and how I see Sri Lankan writing in English. So my one want is that when it comes to Sri Lankan writing in English, to see good books. We live in a country where English is not even an official language, and yet a small number of us write in English and may even consider English as our first language. The English language readership in the country is even smaller. So I would say that if you are writing in English in all genres, fiction, non-fiction, poetry, etc., you have to try your best to write as well as you can, because you are competing with other writers of the English language internationally in a way. So in short, why would a reader in Sri Lanka pick a book written by a Sri Lankan out of thousands of books written in English from all over the world? Now, how do I see the situation? So I believe that at no time have more books been written and published in English in our Sri Lankan literary history as now. And I believe that both the opportunity to self-publish or approach publishing houses like mine, the Perera-Hussein Publishing House, and the establishment of events like the Gratian Prize, the once held Gold Literary Festival, the once held Fairway Prize, and the burgeoning number of book clubs and writers' writing groups have in no small way contributed to that. So this allows for Sri Lankan writers writing in their particular style, like Shehan Karunatilaka, Karl Mahler, Ashok Ferre, Lal Madhavatagedara, to showcase their stories with their signature technique. Sri Lankans have realized they don't have to write books in standard English for them to be considered good books. Now, being a publisher, I see many people writing books, and that's great. But books and writing are subjective. I may like something, you may not, and writers have to understand that. So, for instance, a personal bugbear is when a story written by a Sri Lankan is set in a foreign country without much context. I think this came up in one of the panels earlier, because I think you can write any genre with Sri Lankan characters and a Sri Lankan setting. Now, one of the biggest lacuna in our writing tradition is that of writers unwilling to be edited. So much so, they often bring a manuscript to a publisher that is nowhere ready to be seen. And of course, when it's rejected, they are slightly upset. Sri Lankan writers in English should be open to editing a lot more. I believe there are a few professional editors in Sri Lanka, but there are many more internationally whom they can access through the internet. So a writer should be able to find an editor who will be able to work with their manuscript satisfactorily to make it better. So to conclude, I will say that I want to see Sri Lankan books written in the author's particular style, whether it be written in standard English, Sri Lankan English, or using slang, dialect, whatever, but that it be good. For actually, if it was good, we will not be having a discussion like this. We will be delighting instead that we have interesting, intelligent, socially relevant books written by Sri Lankan writers who write in English. Thank you.
Thank you, Ameena. Now may I invite Mahesh Hapugoda to make his opening statement.
Well, thanks for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts. Basically, I'm just having a bit of a internet connection, issue also. Bear with me for that. And I consider Sri Lankan writing in the Hegelian atmosphere of particular and the universal. So what I've been teaching my students and what I've been reading, including Sham Saludare, maybe Jan Arasanagam, Richard de Soisa, I mean, just to name few, the latest writers like Ameena and all this. I consider them belonging to the Sri Lankan particular, Hegelian particular. And then you have a broad existential atmosphere in the world, in the global writers. Fitzgerald, Jane Austen, Hemingway, and Ishiguro, Murakami, you name it. And Ameena was asking a fundamental question there, like, why not global? We have few examples, maybe few examples. I mean, Sri Lankan examples who are reflected in the global atmosphere, but not to the extent that the Western readers read them. I mean, for exotic purposes, you can read Giraya. That is pure exotism, how an Asian woman can be mysterious or something like that. But not in its real existential essence. Like, do we read Sham Salodore in the same, just to experience the same as we read Fitzgerald? I'm not saying that the Fitzgerald is that big and we are so small. No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about how to connect the particular with the universal. And when you read Jane Arasan, or even the non-examples like Sham Saludare or I mean, Richard de Soisa, and even Andra Singh. And even, I will just make this exclusion, like Patrick Fernando. He belongs, I consider him a bit differently. But when you read, I mean, you can say that these people have issues to talk about. and they have burned. These are serious political issues, I understand. Yes, true. But don't you like reaction to the mega politics, reactions to the political, sort of how to maltreatments or marginalization or polarization and things like that. And those writings remain there. You may read them for a while, but for an example, for me, I don't think that I'll be able to read Jina Arisanayagam the way that I read sometimes Ernest Hemingway or Achabe for that matter, or even a pure existential writer like Sartre. I may understand her grievances, her reaction, all that's true. And this feminism, all these things I can understand. But do we read them when we really want to withdraw from this world? Why do we need literature? We need literature just not to live in this chaos. And we don't want another chaos. When we retreat from this society and sit there, somewhere and read some literature, because we want some withdrawal, we want a detachment from the reality, and that is where we need literature. About that, literature doesn't provide me that opportunity of withdrawal, opportunity of aloofness, detachment, and perhaps spirituality for that matter. And all these things are not there. You have reaction, full of reaction. This happened to me, that happened to that auntie, and these Sinhalese attacked me that way, this way, all the blood and all that. I think, yes, these are important things. I understand, but not in its Western, I mean, from a Habermasian and Jamesonian way, not in that withdrawing sense of the retreat that we need in literature. So I don't see that. Added to this, we'll also take this wonderful global example of Ishiguro. Ishiguro, I mean, just an example, and Kawabata Yasunari, there are so many other Japanese examples. What they did was, I mean, when it comes to Ishiguro at least, he established his writing in that Western withdrawal from reality. The reason why he became so popular or widely read, even Murakami, is because he used his Japaneseness, the Japanese existential whatever, to establish some form of difference from the day-to-day chaos. And that is a word used by Jameson, the day-to-day reaction. So in that sense, these particulars, those particulars like Japanese particular, I must say, became a global phenomenon, a global experience for the wider readership. I think that is what we lack in our Sri Lankan writing. If we can elevate, that's my responsibility as a critic. So if we can elevate our writing up to that level, I think we can see more results. I think we will be able to see more. That's my initial response.
Thakshala Tissera.
Well, thank you to the organizers for putting together this wonderful platform for us to come together and think about Sri Lankan English writing. And although I'm going last on this panel, I'd like you to, or rather I'd like to take you back to this idea of definitions, or what is it that we call Sri Lankan English writing? Is it, I mean, what utility can we gain, or what limitations do we encounter when we label a body of writing Sri Lankan English writing? Is this in a way a reference to a particular dialect known as Sri Lankan English and the works that are written in that particular dialect? Or are we using Sri Lankan as a signifier of national identity and English as a linguistic one? Or is it a much broader reference to texts in English that are in some way connected to Sri Lanka. Now, various critics, of course, have different opinions of what exactly constitutes Sri Lankan literature. But something everyone agrees on is that there definitely is such a body of work. Now, I personally advocate for taking the broadest possible view and using the label Sri Lankan English writing in the most loose sense possible. And I will explain my reasons for this position. Now, one debate is, of course, where do we point to as the genesis of this corpus? Do we mark it, for example, by key firsts, like, for instance, Lucian de Silva's publication of The Dice of the Gods in 1970s, incidentally in London, not in Colombo? Or do we include earlier colonial writers, as in British officials who lived or worked in Ceylon and wrote about the place? It seems common sense to kind of exclude them, but on the other hand, if you take a text like, say, John Davies' An Account of the Interior of Ceylon, or even going pre-British colonial times to the much well-known Robert Knox's Historical Relations, these are texts that not only continue to be published both in English and Sinhalese, but also keep cropping up in, say, for instance, state textbooks. And they have contributed considerably to our popular and also education-sanctioned imagination of what constitutes Sri Lanka. So even if we don't consider these texts Sri Lankan, in a strange twist of fate, the texts have contributed to what we consider Sri Lanka or Ceylon. Now, another text I think very beautifully illustrates this difficulty of having neat categorizations is, of course, Leonard Woolf's Village in the Jungle. And quite apart from the fact that it mostly receives critical recognition from Sri Lankan academics and hardly a glance from those studying British modernist literature or the wider Bloomsbury Circle, it's a text that has taken a life of its own in its Sinhalese translations, particularly Lester James Pierce's cinematic adaptation of Baddegama, with its stellar cast of Vijay Kumaratunga, Malini Fonseca, Joe Abe Vikrama, and even Arthur C. Clarke. But on the other hand, let's consider Arthur C. Clarke. Despite his extremely long residence on the island and prolific output, also his books are translated into Sinhalese, does anyone consider the writings of Arthur C. Clarke as Sri Lankan literature? Now, it's true they have very little to do in terms of content with Sri Lanka, but on the other hand, would you contest the place of, say, Sita Kulatunga's Dari the Third Wife, which is set entirely in Nigeria? Now, another significant point of contention, of course, is this distinction between writers who are domiciled in Sri Lanka and those who are domiciled abroad. And this is where you often have this discussion of, or even accusation of exoticization, lack of authenticity on the part of the writers who primarily live and seem to be publishing for a broader global audience, kind of making the exoticization a selling point, if you will. And yet, if there were a canon of Sri Lankan English literature, works such as Shyam Selvadurei's Funny Boy and Michael Ondaatje's Anil's Ghost would definitely make an appearance on that list. But would we add Ondaatje's English Patient to the list? And yet, this particular work, more than any other, has probably done the most for Sri Lankan English writing by enabling the establishment of the Gratian Prize, which now has a legacy of 25 years. On a different vein, would you recognize Shobha Shakti's Gorilla as Sri Lankan English writing? It's written originally in Tamil by a former LTT child soldier, translated into English, and it's a work that the author identifies as autofiction. It's a tale as much about refugee status in France as it is about the protagonist's experiences in Sri Lanka. Now, up to this point, I've only been unsettling the notion of what might constitute Sri Lankan English, or rather what might not constitute Sri Lankan English. And yet, walk into any bookshop in Colombo and there will be shelves called Sri Lankan English literature. So let me just adopt that common sense notion for a moment. if I were to identify a single dominant factor, a characteristic that kind of speaks as this is something that is seen across many works of Sri Lankan English writing, and this is something that Mahesh also alluded to, is this narrative of conflict. It's not just an engagement with war or the civil war, but the multiple social conflicts we've been having in the country. Even books that are not explicitly about war, such as Shehan Karunatilaka's Chinaman or Yasmin Gunaratna's A Sweet and Simple Kind, end up being considerably about ethnic relations and the civil war or the JVP conflict. The late Qadri Ismail argues that this turn to literature in relation to the Sri Lankan conflict can be understood by considering literature as a verb rather than a noun. So not so much looking at it as a text, but rather as a means of understanding something, of slow, patient working through something. And I do understand here the critique that Mahesh just made about this being reactionally rather than aesthetically pleasing and allowing a kind of extraction, a movement inwards from the world. And yet, in a country which does so little to talk about the horrific violence we've had, literature provides both a site and a means by which to memorialize the past and refashion the future. And if done rightly, I would argue, it can actually create that kind of literature we yearn to read, pick up and read. And for me, the best example for that would be Ambalavana Sivanandan's When Memory Dies. Incidentally, a winner of the Commonwealth Prize for First-Time Writers. Of course, Sivanandan has a prolific academic oeuvre, but this is his only novel, and it's extremely powerful too, quite the saga. But on the other hand, the ethnic conflict in particular is one of those topics that keep cropping up when we have this debate or dichotomy of resident versus migrant writer. Who is more authentic? Who has the right to write? Now, writing fiction in particular is an act of imagination. So this question of authenticity becomes a problematic and perhaps a moot point. And besides, the post-colonial nation that is, or the nation-state project that is Sri Lanka, is a highly exclusionary one, especially if you look at literature as a site in which, or a method by which to contest those exclusions. Should we also engage in a project of exclusionary canon formation? Now, as much as I don't make a distinction between resident and non-resident writers in terms of who is more authentic or who has the right to narrate, I do want to draw your attention to the material inequalities between most writers abroad with access to wider audiences and bigger name publishing houses, and the conditions in which most, but perhaps not all, resident writers write. There is, after all, a political economy that affects how much time and energy and money a writer can devote to their craft, and how much publicity and exposure that a published book gets. Let me take you back to 2018, when the judges of the Fairway Literary Award deemed that the award for English writing was non-awardable. And one of the justifications was this question of not meeting a certain international standard. Come back to the present, and one of the most exciting things happening right now for Sri Lankan English writing is Kanya de Almeida's I Claim the Blank winning the Regional Commonwealth Short Story competition and being in the running for the big prize. It's a wonderful text, extremely rich, and I would urge all of you to read it. It's available online for the last couple of days. Now, not only is Kanya de Almeida an experienced writer, but she also has an MFA from Columbia. If you take last year's winner of the Commonwealth Overall Short Story Competition prize, she was also the folder of an MFA from a US university. Now, I have my critiques of MFA programs in general, but they're one example of the kind of material resources required to perfect one's craft as a writer. Pretty much nowhere in the Sri Lankan education system do we devote time to creative writing. There are no local grants allowing writers to devote years of their life to writing. There are few publishing houses, fewer editing services, and perhaps no money to get services from abroad. So although I started out by, through a very conceptual questioning of what is Sri Lankan English writing, my vision for it is, on the one hand, defining the term as broadly as possible and avoiding the impulse towards any kind of exclusionary canon formation. And on the other, a wish rather than a vision for the development of the material conditions that would allow a resident Sri Lankan writer to be able to devote themselves fully for their craft. Thank you.
Thank you, Thakshala, and thank you, Ameena and Mahesh, for your opening statements. So I think you addressed very important points in terms of publishing, global reach, and the sense of authenticity in terms of resident and diasporic writing, which Thakshala, as you say, becomes a moot point in terms of what you think of avoiding exclusionary canon formation in terms of your subjective envisioning of Sri Lankan English writing of the future. But in terms of what all three of you were talking about, I think specifically Ameena and Thakshala, I want to refocus and reorient this discussion towards publishing, where we have a lot of writers who are actually interested in e-publications. So I have seen a lot of writers in doing Kindle publications via Amazon and even social media. So we see that a lot of writers are very keen in e-publications. So I want to ask you, like, what do you think about that sort of turn towards e-publications in the future? Do you think these would be mediums more writers would be interested in? And what do you think about this development towards the future, considering that this is like a very cost-effective and a very convenient way of publication? Up to you, panelists. Yes, we can start with Ameena.
Yes. So I think that's a very interesting question, because speaking as a publisher who does mainly traditional books, I mean, we do print hard copy books, and but I too have noticed this trend, and I think it is actually wonderful. It's a wonderful, affordable way for writers from anywhere in the world to access a reading audience. And a good example is Yudhanjaya Vijayaratna, who published first on Amazon and who ended up with a 5-book deal with HarperCollins. He actually, I tell him he should thank us, because he came to us with his manuscript, number cast, I think. And both Sam and I read it, and we said, there's an amazing story here, but we don't understand it. And I was happy that we were able to be frank with him. And we said, if we took it on, we would actually make you edit it, because what are we? We are in our mid-50s. Yudhanjaya is in his 20s. We run a very small publishing house, which means we're coming in with all our limitations of what we have been exposed to. So we sent him away. We said, we don't think we will do justice to this novel. He published first on Amazon, and then with the reviews, with being very, very active on social media, he has had an amazing trajectory. I have noticed as well, I mean, just recently, I saw that Amanda Jayatissa has got a 2-book deal with an imprint called Berkeley. I think it's an arm of Penguin. Amanda also was writing in a slightly different genre. This looks a very interesting, but slightly convoluted book. It brings in all the elements of social relevances to Sri Lanka, and also the fantastic. I think e-publishing is a superb alternative, and it cuts out the print publisher. It cuts out us. It cuts out being monitored and advised in a way, but you get monitored and advised by a larger global audience who gives you feedback, and you're able to develop in a particular way. So I think more power to that.
I do wholeheartedly agree with Ameena that it is a form of publication that opens up wide avenues, especially to a global audience. So I would like to focus maybe on not so formal means of digital publication. And this is not something that's completely new to the Sri Lankan English writing scene. An older form, for example, was rightclick.com, which was quite popular at one point. And this was, I think, pre-Facebook becoming, a central means of communication in Sri Lanka. And yet, what I think I would really like to see is also writers using the strengths and the modality of digital publication. So what I would really like to see digital writers targeting a digital publication do is not trying to replicate a print book on the web, but using all the, I'm not even sure what to call it, but all the characteristics that you have in that digital space to narrate their story in new and exciting ways, because it no longer needs to be just text on a page. It's not only print anymore, but you are opening up a wider way of, a very rich way of bringing in audiovisual material, hyperlinks, comments, real-time commentary, adding all of that to make something that is not just an alternative to a printed book, but something that is a completely new genre altogether.
Well, I can understand that we all are trying to be so postmodern. That is true. Yeah, that's okay in the sense that if you go to Blackwell, or you see Penguin, you see Picardo, book by Murakami, sort of you have the fetish desire to buy that. So I don't think that the internet or the digital publication carries that charisma. So I mean, when you see Routledge by Eric, a text from Eric Fromm, you tend to buy it, like it's so fetish. That is modern fetishism. So I think I'm for that, Thakshala, basically. So I'm an old-fashioned guy, and I will go for a Penguin stuff, and it's very hard, to get it published. Get through that channel is not that easy. You can, like me, you can write that on Facebook, and it's have to be heavily edited if it is possible. I will never become a global writer of that. I don't want to, it's okay. But I will take this, very sorry, take this opportunity also to ask, Vihanga's questions. Where's the academia? Well, it's in the same place, of course. Where you left it. But I think now some students coming from rural areas are trying. And that makes me really happy today. I also got an abstract from one of my students using Freud to analyze Patrick Fernandez. I mean, she's coming from Putlam, man. Sort of to see that, it really makes me happy. Like, that we are heading somewhere out of all this chaos, sort of, all the ships burnt all around and all that, sort of with all the disappointments. There's a little hope, like, understand, like some academics, and some, not all, some young ones, like you can see even here, people are trying. So they are trying their level best to, sort of to do something to make an impression. So my modern argument still is sort of still valid here, I hope. I'm very sorry to be so old-fashioned, but at the same time, I think this, can I take this example of Ishiguro? I mean, I don't know whether I might get, disconnected. And before that, I should say example of Ishiguro. But I want my Sri Lankan writers, my dear colleagues, to do, like, go beyond identity politics. This is what I've been telling. And this is a different terminology that I'm using. I'm not using the same terminology that Frederick Jameson used in 1986. No, I'm not using that. I'm using a different conceptualization and a terminology just to say that it is required. When it comes to Ishiguro, he's no longer a Japanese. Neither he is British, and he does not have a place in the sense, ontologically speaking, he is no place. This is what we call no placeness. Neither British, no Japanese, nothing, nothingness. In this entire universalization, I think that is our legacy. And that is the legacy of so-called, if you want, the legacy of Buddhism, if you want.
Thank you, Mahesh. So considering this shift towards writing, as you have been saying, this importance of writing within a global scale towards this global shift. Considering our current status of Sri Lankan English writing, we have been seeing that a lot of writers are actually interested in genres which are sci-fi, depicting the future, futuristic turns, maybe punk, uh, science fiction, sci-fi, steampunk, fantasy, and if you have been, I'm sure you have seen like our previous sessions too, where certain writers were very much interested in medical thrillers. These kind of genres are very much interested to especially young writers within the present. So what do you think about this sudden interest, especially considering our times? We are currently in a pandemic. So depicting the future within this kind of negative repercussions in the future, maybe like looking at the scientific technologies and seeing how things go to the south, and looking at all the devastations which are havoc in the future, and maybe like looking at everything in a very dystopian sense. That is the best word I think I can look towards. Dystopian literature. That is one way, one genre which I can use to categorize all these kind of literatures which a lot of writers are interested in. So this turn towards dystopian literature, this interest towards dystopian literature, what do you think about this interest among the writers and this developing interests towards writers towards the future, especially like considering that kind of literature which are published in digital as well, like in e-publications such as Shankari Chandran's Barrier, and I think Amanda Wick's books, and a number of other writers. We can start with perhaps Mahesh.
Well, sort of look, the concept of dystopia which emerged after the COVID pandemic. This word was there somewhere in, sort of old-fashioned French literature and all that. But it suddenly popped up after Gilgamesh and Slavoj Žižek, obviously, because there's a now we are experiencing sort of, well, we have planned for us, so this word has some validity there. Now I think true, but don't you think, seriously speaking, that we live in a time of uncertainty, an uncertainty that we have never experienced before, even in the First and the Second World Wars, and the most sort of the terrible time. I mean, if you can see, that's the Cold War. And even we were not that uncertain. Look at the Sri Lankans. Are we sure of the next moment? Are we sure about tomorrow? Now today a ship, next day an aeroplane, the following day maybe an spacecraft, what? So I mean, something will fall. I don't know, from the sky. And this uncertainty has created great anxiety in us, and that is good for literature on the other hand. So you can write sort of that kind of literature, but I think kind of sort of, how to put it, like I don't have a term for that, like how do you say that, like a destructive sort of self-destructive, maybe science, sort of, and even in pornography, the same, like, it's not exactly the real human bodies anymore. Like you get into the digital 3D, sort of images, which are more powerful, like, than the real human bodies, and they perform, more than what your real body can, like, so these areas, I mean, we should pay attention to these, how to put it, like the depression, the anxiety, and inability that we can, I mean, the life has become so hyper real, dear. Like, don't you think that so many hopes maybe 1 year ago about this government now gone? Like people don't have hopes anymore. Like, it's everything is in a kind of what. So I think it is in this atmosphere, globally, even globally, it is in this atmosphere, I think, that we are becoming so hyper real, and our desires, this has something to do with our desires. So the desires are so sort of dry, and we don't have that drive to live anymore. So I can see the death drive, Freudian death drive, coming in this sort of dystopian so-called digital, how to put it, 3D kind of hyper-real literature. So this is what I see as a symptom, the symptom of modern humanity, especially the postmodern humanity.
Ameena?
So I'm fascinated by Mahesh's answer in a way, because it indicates that we are currently living in dystopian times. So, which means that anything can happen. And but I first want to talk to you about your question about genres. So, Nilani, as a publisher, I actually feel that we have been really scarred by the 26 years of war. For so long, people thought for writing to be valid, they had to write about war. They had to write about ethnic conflict. Those are the only books that were being discussed. They were the only books that were thought to have of any weight. And if anybody wrote about, just ordinary life, if it didn't have some element of conflict, it was, dismissed. A really good example is even today. I mean, my newest publication, Ibn Battuta in Sri Lanka, is actually following a 14th century Moroccan traveler. Somebody told me, I'm so disappointed with the book. You didn't write anything about the conflict. So he never went to the conflict areas. If he did go to the conflict areas, I would have had an opportunity. I can't put the conflict in to make it weighty and worthy, of some academic or somebody's uh, mindset, to satisfy their mindset of what is good literature and what is not. The other thing about genre is, I, as a publisher, I want to see, Mahesh said, why do we need literature? Why do we need it? He said to escape. So literature should be accessible to all types of people, the educated, the middle educated, the uneducated. If they have to find ways to escape. At the book fair, there is a Sinhala publisher. He runs a stall all by himself. I believe his name is Edward Malavarajji. He's a rock star. And what does he publish? Love stories. Love story, love story, love. There are lines of people. I mean, there's nobody queuing outside our publishing house, but there are queues of people outside his. I'm actually a little bit envious when I go on my rounds and I see him. So I think the Sinhala, my pity, my regret is that I am not fluent in Sinhala, because that is something else, quite different. And I think Mahesh, perhaps even Thakshala, might have access to it more than me. So I want to see more Sri Lankan writing in more genres. In romance, I want to see even porn, right? Mahesh, I want to see in all the yes, all kinds of genre. I want to see more Sri Lankan writing. About dystopian, I first heard the word dystopian when I began watching movies. And I think the movies were the first to project these. You have Blade Runner long ago. You have this movie called Blade Runner. Today there is the Blade Runner 2041 or whatever, but that was the original. And they projected a dystopian future in one way, but something Sam and I, we love dystopian movies, but what we've always discussed together is that how come they always share a vision of how the world is going to be. So it's always dark, always dismal, always destruction. So you have this blown apart world. Technology is not working in basic ways, but they have like ultra uber technology in some ways. So those are the two things I want. So dystopian novels, it's inevitable. Literature is also going to go that way. It's what appeals to the young. If you want to hold the young reader's interest, you need to go in that direction. And I think they are the ones who are going to bring it to us. They are the one, in a way, I find it fascinating and I'm pleased because for some time, the young were disengaged with what was happening. If they find engagement in envisioning a dystopian world via the way Sri Lanka is going or using Sri Lanka as the center of the dystopian world, I'm all for it because I think perhaps we can even see our solutions in those pieces of writing. But Mahesh, I just want to add to you, I mean, I think as creatives and as in the arts world, we have reason to be very depressed because I recently read in the newspapers that the Sri Lankan government, in all its wisdom, has decided to cut down the A-level arts intake to 25%. When I read that, I truly wanted to slit my wrists because if the government does not realize that actually the future of the country relies on its arts, on its culture, on its creativity, and they're moving towards STEM, welcome to the dystopian world sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Thank you, Ameena. Yes, Thakshala.
Well, as someone who works in the environmental humanities, I end up teaching a lot of dystopian texts. And my students often end up realizing that it is actually a dystopian present, because often what is depicted as dystopian for the first world is the present of the developing world. So lack of food, political chaos, war, technology failing or technology never having arrived, illness, famine. These are conditions that exist in the elsewhere, in that imagination of the first world. But bringing it to Sri Lankan English literature, one of the earlier texts to actually use the genre of dystopia is Ramesh Gunasekara's Heaven's Edge. And you have that dystopian take, which reading it in a post-war context, right now, seems scarily real, frighteningly so in a way. And I guess what is useful about genres like dystopia or the dystopian is, in a way, it's a way of trying to think through our present fears and to try and imagine alternative futures. But also, if we keep going back to, say, all the way back to Mary Shelley's dystopian, keep forgetting the title, but I think it's The Last Man. The dystopian narrative has a very long history. And I think recognizing that history is important both as readers, critically aware readers, and as writers. There are perhaps no new stories. We're just saying old stories in new ways.
Thank you, Thakshala. With that, I would like to go to the Q&A session because we have received around 3 questions. I know that you have sent your answers in the chat box, but I would like you to address this in verbally as well. So the first question we have is for Mahesh. How do you see the academy's role in setting benchmarks and giving direction to Sri Lankan writing? Has it changed? What further changes can benefit the field in general?
Sri Lankan literature has been introduced to Sri Lankan, sort of academic whatever studies. I think a long time ago and has been there for a while. And with with updating or even without, it has been there. So we were also taught Sri Lankan literature, the, kind of funny boy, the Gira and all those stuff, and very boring even at that time. Boring in the sense, I mean, to read Punyakanti Vijayanayaka's stuff is that mystery of a woman, and sort of deconstruct that mystery to reach her core is a big puzzle, and I don't like puzzles, and and I don't consider women as a puzzle. Therefore, I mean, it never appealed to me. But actually speaking, I have been propagating this idea, and I normally don't call this Sri Lankan. Well, this is just a start for our global writing, and very, very correctly Amina pointed out that, and she doesn't want the war coming into her literature, her books and everything. Like, we have been reading this for centuries now. What is this? And the war again, war, and if we make a movie now for the global audience, so we want the war, like, some poor woman, sort of victimized by that or this or the other, or a boy who is deprived, all these Marxist ideas coming in and all that. There's nothing wrong in Marxism. The point is that the portrayal of Sri Lanka, and we portray women like this to the global world. What is this? I mean, our women are like that. So with this, all the mystery, exotic, and you would never know who they are. Look at these women, like they are so, I mean, they are accessible, and what is wrong with them? Like, there's nothing. So, I mean, we need a literature. If you really want Sri Lankan literature, I want a positive spirit in them. It doesn't mean positivism, like, some optimism, some desire in them, as Edward Malvarachian or Karnasendra, because they bring in some desire, some appeal. This is why I should live in this damn world, the God-forsaken earth. That you must have some, as Heidegger says, that you are thrown into this world, and you must find some organic reason to live in this. Maybe love is the only reason that makes us worth living in this world. And why don't talk about that? Love is far more important in an atmosphere of chaos, don't you think? And because you live in the war, and you go to the book, again you have the war. So what is this? You don't want literature for you want literature to withdraw from that and get into some, how to put it, like some vacancy, some void. There must be some, sort of fathomless, bottomless void in that literature, a desire, some desire. Without desire, I don't think so. Therefore, I'm a Christian in that sense, of course. I mean, though I am a born Buddhist, I mean, I'm for that. Therefore, I think we are, sort of in a way introducing that to the curriculum, like, to Sri Lankan literature. I'm criticizing it oftentimes, but I teach them in such manner, even others, just to overcome Nietzschean sense. Like, you read Sri Lankan literature in order to overcome, sort of that border, that limit, and even to go beyond, sort of beyond anything. So to be global, you should read, and you should be global if you take the real spirit that we have in our country. So that is how we can be global, and that is why other nations have become global. We are doing our level best in a way, but I don't know. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahesh. That reminds me of one of Professor Bill Ashcroft's sessions, where he mentioned that nowadays there is this need towards utopian hope in literature, as you said, the need for positive spirit, and that is very much necessary. And there is another question for Thakshala. And there is one more question, so I very quickly read it. Thakshala, as an academic, how do you think Sri Lankan English teaching should change in the next decade?
Okay, so let me kind of contextualize the answer I've already put in the chat. So one of the reasons why I think I would like to see more Sri Lankan English literature content in curricula across the board. And when I say across the board, I'm definitely not referring only to university level, but throughout. So my own education in literature, I went to a school where we had literature from grade 6. We started with Six Tales from Shakespeare, then it was Tom Sawyer, then we went on to Jane Eyre, etc. Went all the way until O levels, which is when you have a state imposed literature syllabus. And that was the first time that I encountered Sri Lankan literature as a part of the syllabus. So for me, fortunately, I suppose, my encounter with Sri Lankan literature was what I read for pleasure in a way. So works such as Karl Muller, Raja Proctor's Fisherman's Daughter was probably the first book I read. These didn't come to me as school curricula, but these were books that were fascinating for someone whose literature education was so shaped by that Western canon and a very rigid idea of what that Western canon was. So I think one of the ways in which you can even bring literature into the language learning classroom is by incorporating these texts, which might have some, which might be easier for students to relate to, rather than a canonical British literary text. On the other hand, my pedagogical answer is not so much how do we teach Sri Lankan English literature in the classroom, but how do we teach English literature in the Sri Lankan classroom? And I feel that often, and I can only speak through my own experiences, is that we tend to focus on trying to get all the students to achieve that height of critical acumen, ability, all of that. And yet, there's this neglected back row of students who are in the English literature classroom, who are not special degree students, who are struggling to get that C, and they are the ones we don't usually target, because what do you do when you have 45 to 30 students in a class and one instructor? You let them drop by. You're happy that they just pass with an S and you forget about it. But these are the students who are more likely to go to schools, become teachers, teach in rural schools often. So how can we make that experience more relevant for them and something that is empowering, instead of something that makes you question yourself and constantly think about, am I going to get my BA or am I going to flunk?
Thank you, Thakshala. And I would like to direct the last question to Ameena. English is called a link language in Sri Lanka. Has Sri Lankan English writing been a link literature of sorts? If not, can it become one?
So I always like to say that in Sri Lanka, you have 3 parallel literary traditions, that is Sinhala, Tamil, and English, and they are on parallel tracks and they never meet, because either we're taught our second language so badly that we are actually not fluent enough to read the other language, or we are not taught even one language properly, I would say. So how I used to think that translation would be the best way to get books across to the other languages. But I've been rethinking that, and I believe actually it is teaching these languages just better. As a Muslim, I have the ability, because I learned in the English stream, I learned Sinhalese very badly. I was taught it very badly as a second language. And I picked up bad Tamil from home. You know, my mom, my grandmother, my grand aunts, they would speak amongst themselves in Tamil. They never spoke to me in Tamil. I regret that. And then I have a pidgin Tamil. that I speak, but I am understood. I can travel anywhere in the world. There are many more Muslims who actually are extremely fluent in all three languages. How is it that you have a community where that is fairly common, especially the Muslims in the southern coast and the western coast know English, Sinhalese, and Tamil, and then you have the other two populations like Tamil, the Tamil speakers and the Sinhalese speakers who don't know another language. So I think it is in the teaching, and if we are determined that English without so maybe I should direct this question actually to Mahesh, who is in the Sri Lankan university system, because I would get, not having gone through a Sri Lankan university, I would get a bit worried why this concept of kadua is still going on. When have they not understood, at least by the 2000s, that kadua can be yatura, the key to opening instead of the sword of dividing. So that's where I rest my case. I'm not exactly the most competent person to answer that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Ameena. So since we are since it's 11:01, I think we should end the session here. So thank you so much for the panelists, Ameena, Mahesh, and Thakshala, for having the discussion today. I think we had a very fruitful discussion on this session. So thank you so much for sharing your insights or your subjective visions of Sri Lankan English literature. So I would like to end the session here. And now I would like to invite Chatushki to start the next panel.